This year alone, the One Piece card game has amassed thousands of players to begin their TCG journey. With its enticing prize structure and relative low barrier to entry, new players and TCG veterans alike are all out to level up their game. But with hundreds of Patreons to choose from and players a full set ahead of you posting full-length guides on exactly how the game should be played, it can be difficult to know when to break the habit of net decking and begin your own brewer's journey.
It's your boy Beatsbash back at it again with another banger of a video, and today I'm here to take you guys through my thought process on how I go about solving a deck or solving a problem in the meta. But in order to do this today, I think that it's necessary to paint a picture for us to use a demonstration, and that involves conquering one of my greatest fears, making an OPTCG sim video.
Ho ho ho!
Stop it, Patrick, you're scaring him!
Now, I know I've been very vocal about how I don't really enjoy using the simulator to create content, and I don't think it's really visually appealing or entertaining for the viewers. At the end of the day, nothing compares to paper card games in general, but because I know the people need to see this, I'm going to get over it. And like I always say, when it's all on the line and you need the right guy to get the job done, call God's man at 155 pounds. Before we get into actually building the deck, I want to go over a few rules concerning the purpose behind what we are attempting to accomplish by building this deck. I like to picture myself solving a puzzle, and I'm going to keep perfecting and working on that deck until I've won so much with that deck that I've solved the puzzle and I'm moving on to the next puzzle. But for the purpose of this video, I want you to imagine you're back in high school. You're just as much of a stud as ever and you have luscious blonde hair. Your grandpa has just given you a pyramid-sized necklace known as the Millennium Puzzle. Now, we really need to solve this puzzle because grandpa just got taken away and locked inside of a television by a straight-up madman. But the only way we can unlock the puzzle is by breaking this deck. But unlike traditional stories, instead of fighting our way through Duelist Kingdom to rescue our grandpa, we will solve the Millennium Puzzle by winning a treasure cup and leave our grandpa inside the television while we collect our first serialized One Piece prize card. Now, with that in mind, the first rule of deck building is going to be understanding what our purpose is of this deck, or what is our goal. And for this video, that goal is going to be to hopefully win a treasure cup, and hopefully our grandpa is happy that we won the serialized Luffy. In order to accomplish that goal, we need to ask ourselves a set of questions, with the first question being, what is the meta and what are we likely to expect at this tournament? So let's go ahead and do a little bit of research here. We're just going to go ahead and go to the eggmanevents.com just because it's handily inside of the simulator. No free promos here, but for the purpose of this video, we are going to use the eggman.com. So let's go ahead and check out what the events are looking like from OP04 so far. So we're just going to go ahead and get a general outlook on what these events have been in terms of the representation. I don't know if this is like for the top cut because I'm pretty sure top cut has been removed in most of these events, and online there's no top cut anyway, but these are the top placing players at the most recent events, and it's looked like Whitebeard is the most represented deck. And, you know, that's no surprise. There's just a lot of people who have, you know, a low level of skill and they like to force Whitebeard.
Ha! Gay!
But one thing specifically, we're going to be preparing for an in-person treasure cup, and so we specifically want to look at the data from the in-person events because I think that the dynamic for online and in-person is quite different. So if you are preparing for an in-person event, I highly recommend specifically looking at what the meta is shaping up to be in those in-person events because I think it just gives you a more realistic perspective of what you're actually going to see. So it looks like Whitebeard is leading the way in terms of the in-person events as well. Law Whitebeard, Zoro Katakuri, you know, maybe some Grape Dofi. I think anything past that, you're betting on going against a matchup that realistically you might go against one of those, but probably like not many more. And I want to prepare for the matchups that I'm going to see most frequently. So with that in mind, I think there are two distinct ways that you can approach a tournament. Number one being playing one of the most represented or the best decks in terms of the power level, or you can play a deck that attempts to beat those top decks. Now, I tend to have more of a preference towards playing a deck that is angled at beating the top decks because there are certain advantages to bringing a strategy that other people do not expect. And typically you're going to have a higher ability to change what the cards are in those decks and get a surprise out of your opponent. But that's not always going to be the case. You know, there are very niche metas where if you're playing the best deck and it's a tier 0 meta, meaning there is only one best deck in the room, then there are very, very niche scenarios where everyone is going to share the exact same list.
And all these changes, no one's fusion summoned yet.
For the most part, in the One Piece card game, I would say that that's relatively not been true so far, because in One Piece, what's a little bit different than other card games is because it does have a little bit of a higher variance. The best deck in the game that we've seen so far in every single meta has not had a drastically higher win percentage compared to the other decks. So the data does show that Whitebeard has the most appearances in Top Cut, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Whitebeard is like 30% better than some of these other options in the meta. And that's very important to understand, because you don't want to get this idea in your head that you have to play this one specific deck. With that higher variance and higher representation in general in these tournaments, you have to consider that if everyone is playing Whitebeard, then a lot of the Whitebeard players are going to make Top Cut, even if that's not the best deck, if the representation is so vast compared to the other decks brought to the tournament, because those people will eventually go against each other and one of them has to win. So you're going to always see some of the most represented deck within a Top Cut. But in general, you know, you can't always bring a deck that beats those top decks, either because the options that can beat those top decks have a bad matchup spread, or those decks are just on a lower power level in general compared to the rest of the decks. And so you really have to levy in deck building and choosing a deck. How high of a power level does my deck have versus the advantages it has against the top players in the meta? A lot of times you're going to see that is either found somewhere in between, or if it's just the best deck and it's not discovered yet, then you're going to have the highest power level and you're going to have the best matchups. But in the One Piece card game, I don't think that's really been a thing so far, just because of the limited card pool and the fact that we have data from people who played the game before we even got our hands on the game. So with that information, you know, I know that I want to build this deck to be able to have a good matchup versus Law, versus Zoro, versus Whitebeard, and versus Katakuri. I can only prepare to go against so many decks, and so I really just want to focus on those decks I think I'm most likely to go against. We're going to take that knowledge and combine it with some of the principles that we talked about in our card evaluation video. Rule number 2 is ask as many questions as you can. You know, what decks am I likely to expect going against? Also, what decks am I likely to expect to go against later in the tournament, like if I'm winning, because you really need to win streak at the early rounds of this tournament in One Piece specifically, just because of the way that the tiebreaker system works. You're going to have a more narrow focus of decks if you start out 4-0. Like, it's way more likely that you're going to go against, you know, multiple Whitebeards, multiple Laws in a row if you are 4-0. If those are considered the best decks or the most highly appeared in the Top Cut, then those are the decks that are also going to be winning. So it's important to, you know, ask yourself a deeper level of that question, and also ask yourself, out of these top decks, which one fits my play style personally? Because there are going to be people who perform better on certain styles of decks than others, just because everyone has a different style. And I think that in a game where the best deck is not drastically better or higher power level than the other decks, it can be a big benefactor to you as a player to use the deck that is going to perform the best with your playstyle. So for me personally, I tend to feel like in card games in general, I perform best with control decks because I think I really enjoy, extracting value from the board and understanding if an exchange is going to be beneficial for me or more beneficial for my opponent. So that's very important to keep in mind. What is your play style? So for the purpose of this video, I think we're going to go ahead and build a Grape Doflamingo deck because I want to make sure that everyone gets the most out of this video. And Grape Doflamingo is a deck that I have very little experience with, but I do think that it holds some higher power level cards that give you a chance to compete at the top level. And being a deck that we're about to construct that I don't have a vast amount of experience with, you're going to get a good, understanding and a good visualization of how I approach building a deck from the ground up that I am not the most experienced with, and what the steps I will take to understand what kind of skeleton I want to start out with early on. So it's at this point in the video, I really just want to go through and look at the cards that are available in this leader and also understand what our leader is trying to do. So our leader says, end of turn, set up to 2 of your Dawn cards as active. So essentially, if we want to get the most value out of utilizing this leader, we're going to want to have a higher event package than other decks would normally run. And on top of that, we want to have events that are going to be typically 2 cost, preferenced over, maybe 1 cost or 3 cost, specifically depending on what the power level of the event is. And that is because we want to make sure that we're using as much of our Dawn as possible every turn in order to get the biggest advantage from using this leader ability. Because if you're not maximizing what your leader and what your deck is trying to do, at that point, you're using cards that could probably have a bigger benefit in a different type of deck. And so you want to make sure you're asking yourself those questions. What is our deck trying to do? How can we extract as much value and as much utility by using this leader and by, using the cards that are going to give us the biggest incentive to play this leader? So after taking a quick look at the card pool available for this leader, I immediately began to think about the 10 cost Doflamingo. And the reason why I like this card in this archetype is because I think it's one of the biggest incentives to play this leader. Because when you really think about what this card is doing, it's essentially a power creep version of the 10 cost Big Mom, which we have seen be very oppressive since its release. This card is a 10 cost, 10,000 power character, which reads, on play, target up to a total of 3 characters and or leaders that your opponent controls rested, and then those do not become active during the next refresh phase. This card you can't use in every single deck, and so this is just an immediate incentive to utilize this leader because of how powerful of a bomb it is. Now, while it is not searchable and the 10 cost Big Mom is searchable, one of the biggest reasons why those 2 cards are very powerful is because when you play down a 10 cost or 9 cost bomb, the disadvantage of playing those cards is supposed to be 2 things. Number 1, you're leaving yourself vulnerable on the following turn because you won't be able to activate events to defend yourself. And number 2, you won't have any mana to be able to play down blockers. And this card, and as well as the 10 cost Big Mom, mitigate that risk of playing a big drop because the 10 cost Big Mom gives you back a life, which can potentially sustain you. And with the 10 cost Doflamingo, we actually get to double dip into that equation because not only is their leader probably going to be unable to attack us, but we'll also be able to use all of our Dawn in one turn, which is what our deck is trying to do, so we can get the most value out of unresting 2 Dawn and have an event available. Even if you only select 2 targets, since we can hold up an event if we do have one, it's probably still going to be worth it. And this goes along into the lines of, what is my deck trying to do? What is the win condition? And our deck is essentially trying to use all of its Dawn every single turn it can in order to get the most value out of unresting those 2 Dawn. And number 2, we want to try to make it out of the early game, because the late game is very, very strong with how many of these late game high costed bombs that we have. But when then thinking about how our game plan is to try to get out of the early game and use as much Dawn as possible, the film package is an automatic inclusion with those components in mind. We're obviously going to be playing 4 copies of Nami, and then I'm going to add in 4 Brook for right now. I like to add in all the cards that I think could potentially go in the deck and then cut them down to what I feel like it should be after. I'm just going to add in all of the film cards that I feel are good. Obviously, one of the biggest advantages of this deck is that you're able to utilize the purple film cards that were released in the Film Shank starter deck, and you're also able to search your green film cards, which are the more powerful bunch, with the Buena Vista Searcher, which is a really nice touch because Nami can add Buena Vista and Buena Vista can add Nami. Nami makes a lot of sense because, this is what I classify as an infinite value engine, because cards like, Red Nami or Curly Dedan or Buggy, they have on play searches, which just get you a +1. But with this deck, Nami is a card that every single turn, if we protect it, we're going to be able to get a +1. And that's where it becomes an infinite value searcher. And if we're locking down the board with cards such as, 10 cost Doflamingo or our big blockers, then it's going to be very difficult for our opponent to access Nami, which is a really big advantage in a vacuum for itself. I think these are all like the film cards that I would have under consideration outside of the Chopper 2K. You need to have a base amount of 2Ks in the deck. I think I would prefer 8 in this deck because 8 is about the minimum you can get away with running. And we really don't want to have too many defensive cards in our deck because we're going to be running a high event package. It's kind of counterintuitive to have 2Ks in our deck that have no other purpose other than being a 2K when we already have a dedicated amount of cards in terms of our events that we have for that purpose. So realistically, I'd like to get away with as little 2Ks as possible. Okay, I forgot one of the most important cards, Uta. This has been one of the most powerful film cards since the release of the film package. This card aligns really well with what we're trying to do because if we can sacrifice a Dawn by returning it to the Dawn deck in the early game, it's going to allow us to shape up really well in the mid to the late game, because if they attempt to attack our Nami because we tried to get a search, then we're going to be able to mitigate that attack and potentially mitigate an additional attack with the rest effect. And as well, it creates targets for our 10 cost Doflamingo, which also aligns with our game plan. When running a card like Nami, which only looks at the top 3, in order to justify putting this card into our deck, we're going to have to play a higher amount of searchable targets because, you have a more likely chance to fail on a search than you do with like a look at 5 searcher. And so that's very important to note. If there's a card you're specifically looking for, like your 7 cost Monkey D. Luffy, and you don't reveal it off Nami, but you do reveal a Buena Vista, then if you're keeping track of your stack, you may want to take the Buena Vista in order to get a higher likelihood of accessing this Monkey D. Luffy faster. So it makes a lot of sense for us to play this amount of film cards, and we're going to refine those in just a second. I just want to add in all of the events to think about how many we want to play of each before we do any cuts. So we're mainly looking at these 2 cost events because 2 cost events are going to give us the most value out of utilizing our leader ability. So Punk Gibson will definitely be in the deck. And then the new card, Spider's Web, which is probably the best card to run in this style of deck. It allows us to unrest one of our characters at 2 cost, comparably to the 1 cost Paradise Waterfall, which was previously used in the Uses Kid deck. It has synergies with our Nami, being able to protect it by unresting it. This deck is essentially trying to use Protect the Castle on your Nami as one of the win conditions. And the second win condition being to chain back-to-back 10-cost Doflamingos, but considering that card is not searchable, you want to have multiple win conditions, and that's my first thought about this deck. I'm identifying the win conditions and understanding what cards I need to put into the deck in order to make those win conditions a realistic outcome. Another card that I'm very interested in is this Union Armada, because this allows us to increase the amount of cards in our deck with the film tagline without going into the lower value film cards that we would just be playing in our deck, to have as consistent of a chance as possible to hit with our searchers every time we use them. Since Buena Vista is 0 power, if you miss with this searching effect, you're essentially just getting a -1 in card advantage because he has no effect on the game state. So it's very important that we're going to play more targets for our searchers in this deck than other archetypes probably would. And another card that I think works really well with this deck, that I think has a lot of synergies with what we are trying to do and what our win conditions are, is the 5-cost Queen. This is a card that allows us to get deeper into our deck, and after we've completed multiple searchers with our Nami and with our Buena Vista, levying that with the cards we have revealed off of those searches, we will be able to have a higher chance to access our 10-cost Doflamingo off of this draw. And I know some people really like that Guild Toriso card, and I don't think that is a bad card. I think those cards fulfill similar purposes. The biggest difference is that Guild Toriso has a tagline that synergizes with our searchers, but considering we're going to have enough search targets in our deck, I don't think that we really need to play that card. And this card provides immediate impact on play, whereas Guild Toriso has to survive a full turn. And I would just prioritize having the immediate impact on the board, because I think it's very important to have a 5-cost blocker versus a non-blocker in this situation. Because if we get out of the early game, we should be winning that matchup anyway. And Guild Toriso is a card that highly benefits you when you're already in the late game, whereas Queen can give you an impact in the late game, but it's also a highly beneficial card to play during the mid game to protect against those aggressive strategies, which is, most likely going to be the more difficult matchups for us. One other card that I'm interested in is Sugar. The main reason why I want to play this card is because it's going to help us in those aggressive matchups, and it does have some synergies with our cards such as, Spider's Web, where we can unrest Sugar. And considering we should usually have, 1 to 2 blockers on the board, our opponent isn't always going to be able to attack our Sugar for free. And I think there's also a lot of outplay potential with this card, because if we want our opponent to rest their leader or rest a specific character in order to extract value from the board with 10-cost Doflamingo on the following turn, then by resting our Sugar on our opponent's turn, we're creating targets. We're creating more value to be extracted with 10-cost Doflamingo. So I think this card meets a lot of the boxes that I'm interested in checking for this specific archetype. And I think 3 copies is a good amount to start out with Sugar. If you saw my video from the Tulsa Regional, where I had a conversation with Joey Lynch, he actually said that he believes that 3 copies is the correct amount of a card that you should feel comfortable playing when you want to mulligan for this specific card in a certain matchup. And I think that's exactly what this card is, because I feel like this card is really good against aggressive strategies such as Zoro. And if Zoro is able to get on the board before us and kill us before we can establish our Monkey D. Luffy into another blocker, then they're probably going to win the game. So I want to be able to have enough copies of this card to where if I'm in that matchup, I can feel comfortable looking for that card by doing a mulligan. Now, when I look at what this deck is trying to do with the Monkey D. Luffy, obviously, if you play down a card that costs 4, then you're getting a net Dawn advantage of +4. And then additionally, if we have an event, you might get an additional +2 in Dawn advantage for that turn rotation. And with Brook, I don't think that there are enough high quality film cards with a cost of 3 or less in the current card pool to justify playing 4. If we just play this off our Monkey D. Luffy and we don't get the effect to play out a Nami, there's just other things that could be more beneficial for us to put on the board. The 4-cost Uta, such as the 4-cost Roanoa Zoro, because it does only have that 5k stat line. And it's also Slash, which has, you know, an unhealthy interaction with our opponents having a buggy on the board. So I think I want to actually start off with 3 Brook. And another thing is, I actually want to have another low-cost card to be able to utilize with this card. So I think I'm going to include 3 copies of Usopp because I want to be able to get on the board early in this deck. And while creating a 3-cost 5k isn't the best, it does meet that vanilla stat line requirement of being 5,000 power. If we don't open our 3-cost Nami, then we might have to essentially pass and not develop anything on the board turn 2, assuming we are on the play. And so Usopp makes a lot of sense because now we have 7 total targets that we likely want to establish on the board with our Brook, and that adds additional value to playing this card in our deck. And I do think this is an impactful effect, so I think I will include that. With the amount of cards that we have available to put on the board with Monkey D. Luffy, I don't think we need 4 Roanoa Zoro. I do think this is a good card, but once again, this is more of a card that in the matchups it's good against, I want to have it in my opening hand, such as like Whitebeard, where I need a 6k attacker at 4 cost. But in other matchups, it might be a little bit too clunky, considering how many 4-drops we do have in the deck with the Brooks and the Utas. So I think 3 will be a good ratio to start out with. And then in terms of our events, I think that I personally want to start off with 1 less Unit Armada because obviously this card has implications where it can be dead. Because you can only target a film character, considering we are not playing, you know, film Shanks. But it is just basically like a slightly worse version of these 2 cards. And so I still want to play this in the deck because I think it fulfills that role of what we're trying to do. It's probably the 3rd best 2-cost event that we can extract value from. And so I definitely want to include it in the deck, but I think 4 copies is just too much. And now I may go back on this later after doing some testing. There are similar merits to this Punk Gibson, and I think since this is the 2nd worst one, I'd actually like to play 3 copies of it as well because, you know, this is a card that's really good in those aggressive matchups. But considering we have a total of, you know, 10 defensive events, I don't think we want to clog on having too many of these events. I think that 10 is a really good ratio to start out with, being that means that 1 out of 5 cards that you see will be an event. And realistically, you know, having more than 1 event in your hand at a time is clogging up your hand. If we're using all of our Dawn every single turn, we're only going to be able to use 1 of these. And also, our opponent's always going to assume that we have more events than we do because of what our deck is trying to do, and that is a very fair assessment. So I think 10 is a good ratio to start out with. Now, after constructing this skeleton, I do want to take a brief moment to count out how many of the film tagline we have in this deck so that I can calculate the percentages of us hitting with our searchers. So we have a total of 32 film keyword cards, and we have a total of 29 film keyword characters. Now we're going to take a quick moment to head over to the probability calculator to find out the percentage chance of us hitting with each of these searchers. Now there are many different probability calculators you can use. But for this video, I'm just going to be using the Yu-Gi-Oh! Probability Calculator. This is a tool that I've found a lot of use out of over the years, and I would definitely recommend you checking them out because it is a really beneficial tool that they're providing for the card game community. And we're going to go over like how you can use this. So for One Piece, I want to set my deck size as 45 because you're going to be drawing 5 cards from your deck. If you want to, you can go 40 because you are putting 5 cards in your life. But I've found from testing that 45 is going to give you the most accurate representation. And obviously this is not going to be perfect, but it does give us a good estimate of how likely we are to hit with these searchers. So here in this box, I'm going to go ahead and put in Buena Vista. And because we know that Buena Vista cannot search himself, we're going to go ahead and put in the amount as 28 total targets. and we're going to set the max to 5 and the minimum to 1. Okay, so the chance for us to hit with our Buena Vista on turn 1, assuming that we don't open any other film cards, is going to be 99%. And now if you want to do some more work and memorize some lower number percentages, you can actually take it a step further. And let's say we open a film Nami. We can put this at 27. And then now we can memorize this number and we'll know what the chances are for us to hit with our Buena Vista, assuming that we've already seen one film card. Now, let's go ahead and do the same thing for Film Nami. Film Nami can also not search herself, so we're gonna leave it at 28 as well, but we wanna change the maximum to 3 because we're only going to be looking at the top 3 cards of our deck, and we're also going to change the hand size to 3. And so the chances of us finding a search target with Nami, assuming that we haven't seen any other film cards yet, is going to be about a 95% chance. Now, this is very important to notice that with this ratio of film type cards, our searchers have a very, very high likelihood of hitting in a vacuum. And that's one of the reasons why I feel comfortable playing 5-cost Queen versus Gil Turizo, which has the film type keyword, because our likelihood to hit with these cards is already so high, we aren't sacrificing much by including a lower amount of film keyword cards in our deck. And keep that in mind in case you want to test out other kinds of cards in the deck. You should feel comfortable with this percentage of decreasing the amount of film cards. If there's a different card you want to test, you would probably want to take out one of these film cards, considering it's not going to decrease the benefits of hitting with your searchers at this current ratio. So for example, if we wanted to decrease the amount of film cards in our deck down from 28 to 24, not including Nami, then we would be perfectly fine still playing this amount of film cards because our Nami would still have a 90% chance to hit in a vacuum. And I definitely mess around with these numbers when I'm trying to figure out what is the correct ratio for me to justify playing these searchers in my deck. And in my opinion, at this point in the game, where it's very difficult to generate a +1 in card advantage, if your deck can support more searchers, I think that it's probably the best way to play that deck to include as many searchers as your deck can support, as long as the cards that are searchable are of high enough card quality to justify playing those searchers. So after completing all that math to justify my ratios for cards in this deck, this is the final skeleton that I've come up with to begin the testing process for an event. And I am by no means sold on saying this is the correct way to build this leader, but it gives us a good representation of a deck list we can start out with and refine as we test and as we get closer to that event. Now, if you guys want to see me go more in depth on the next step of this process, which would be the testing period before I would take this to an event and how I would go about making certain changes with the rough build that we have come up with today, make sure to let me know down below in the comments, because this is definitely a subject I feel highly knowledgeable about. And if you have any questions about why I played certain cards or why I thought about constructing things a certain way, it's at this time that I want to take a moment to address a question that was asked in my community post. So Ellis Welton asks, what is your ideal amount of 2K counters to have in a deck? And is it ever okay to counter out of attacks early game or just take the hits to go down in life but go up in card advantage? So there are two parts to this question. And the ideal answer to both parts of this is it depends, which I know is a running joke in the card game community as the best answer to every question. But in general, if you want me to give a brief explanation, I would say that at this point in the game, realistically, you want to play between 8 to 14 2K counters Whitebeard being on the top end of that spectrum where maybe you play, 14 to 16. But in general, in most decks at this point in the game, I feel it's correct to play a minimum of 8 and potentially more if your deck needs extra protection or if your deck gets more value out of those cards. So for example, I think 2Ks are overrated when they have no impact on the game. But if your deck has 2Ks that actually have an effect on the board state, I think there's a higher justification for you playing all of those if your deck supports it. So for example, if you're playing a Zoro deck with 4 Fire Fists and you're also playing the 4-cost Brook that reduces things and maybe like Nico Robin, then in addition to the 4 Brook and the 4 Makino that I play in my Zoro deck, I could understand why you would want to include 4 copies of Otama, because that's also a card that not only is it a 2K, it has an impact on the board. Versus something like a blue deck, I typically don't want to have more than 8 2Ks in the deck because I feel like blue cards really don't have any applicable effects on the board in terms of their 2Ks. Like even the best one, Kaya, is a neg1 in card advantage. And so I don't want to open cards that are dead. And then the second part of that question, it really depends on what kind of deck you are playing. So for example, if you're playing yellow Katakuri, in that deck, you want to just get out of the early game and you don't really care about card advantage because your 10-cost Big Mom is going to make up for the fact that you are down on cards because it's essentially giving you a +1, and you're also probably going to end the game on the following turn since your Big Mom already took a life from your opponent and they're not going to be able to stop a 12k attack unless they have a blocker. So in that deck, I feel very, very comfortable, and I think it's like the best way to play the deck is to aggressively discard counters out of your hand to protect every single life you have so that you get more value out of your leader ability when you're attacking in the early and mid stages of the game. But in a deck like our Grape Doflamingo, I typically will take the first 2 life so that I don't get down on card advantage and start thinking about defending our life once we get to 3. Because if you take, too much, then your opponent is going to be able to make a push where you just can't defend it. And so 3 is just a good point where you don't get behind on card advantage, but you're also not under a lot of pressure. Because at the same time, if I did protect, the first 2 life in a deck like this, well, then I wouldn't have that counter to be able to protect my pivotal characters in the mid to late game, such as our 3-cost Nami, where if we can't protect that, then we're losing card advantage, which is not what we want to happen in this style of deck. So it's very important to understand what kind of deck you're playing and what your deck is trying to do. But that's all I have for you guys today. And if you enjoyed this content, smash the like button, turn post notifications on, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another banger. And as always, if it's not the goo, it's got to go. Peace.
Ooh, is that indigo?